Some things are thrown away because they are broken, and some are broken only because the world never learned how to hold them gently. The rain came down cold over the east side of Burlington, Vermont, tapping against the roof of Mercer Auto Works like thousands of small fingers asking to be let in. Caleb Mercer stood beside Bay 3 with a cardboard box at his boots and a cracked ceramic mug in his hand, listening to the new manager explain that the shop was moving in a faster direction. Faster meant younger hands, cheaper hours, fewer pauses to make sure a repair was done right. Caleb did not argue. At 40 years old, he had learned that some doors close more quietly than others, and the quiet ones often hurt the most. He was a white man with broad shoulders shaped by years of service and hard work, a square face roughened by weather, short brown hair touched with gray at the temples, and tired blue eyes that seemed to notice everything while asking for nothing. His faded olive field jacket hung open over a plain work shirt, worn jeans, and rugged boots darkened by the water he had tracked in from the parking lot. There was grease along one knuckle, a thin line of clay-colored dust on his sleeve from an old brake job, and a calm, tired expression on his face that made people mistake endurance for emptiness. The manager kept talking about budgets, restructuring, and difficult decisions. Caleb nodded at the right places. His mind drifted instead to the mug in his hand, the one he had seen sitting on top of the shop trash bin just before the meeting. It was ugly at first glance, heavy and gray-green, with a chipped rim and a hairline crack running from the handle toward the base. Someone had used it for years, then decided it no longer deserved a shelf. Caleb had picked it up without knowing why. Maybe because he understood things that still held shape after being damaged. Maybe because Atlas had refused to stop staring at it from the passenger seat of the pickup outside. When the manager finally stopped speaking, Caleb placed the mug gently into the cardboard box beside his old socket set, a rolled flannel shirt, and a small framed photograph of a field chapel under a pale desert sky. "I appreciate the work while it lasted," he said. The manager looked relieved, as if kindness had spared him the discomfort of another man's pain. Caleb lifted the box and walked out through the side door into the rain. The parking lot smelled of wet asphalt, motor oil, and fallen maple leaves. His old pickup waited near the fence, its blue paint faded nearly gray, windshield fogged along the edges. Inside, Atlas sat upright in the passenger seat, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a black and tan coat and subtle gray along his chest and muzzle, bright amber eyes, alert ears, and the calm loyal posture of a creature who had watched his person survive more than one ending. When Caleb opened the door, Atlas did not bark. He leaned forward and touched his nose to the cardboard box, not the tools, not the photograph, but the cracked mug. A low breath moved from the dog's chest. Not fear. Not warning. Recognition. Caleb paused with one knee on the truck floor. "You like broken pottery now?" he murmured. Atlas kept looking at the mug. Rain ticked against the cab roof. Caleb set the box behind the seat, climbed in, and closed the door. For a while, he did not start the engine. He watched the shop windows blur in the rain, saw men moving behind the glass, saw the life he had counted on continue without him. There was $72 in his wallet, half a tank of gas, and no rent paid beyond Friday. He had been careful. He had worked every hour offered. He had kept his head down, kept his promises, kept moving. Yet somehow he was back in the familiar country of almost nothing. Atlas shifted closer, resting his chin on Caleb's forearm. The weight was warm and steady. Caleb let out a breath he had not meant to hold. "All right," he whispered. "We keep moving." The engine turned over with a tired cough, then settled into a rough idle. He drove without a destination through streets silvered by rain, past closed antique stores, a bakery with yellow light in the windows, a church sign promising grace for weary hearts, and a row of old brick buildings that looked as though they had learned to stand by leaning on one another. At a red light, Atlas suddenly lifted his head. His ears pointed toward the cracked mug in the box behind the seat. Caleb glanced back, then saw something he had missed before. On the bottom of the mug, half hidden beneath dirt and old glaze, was a faint mark, a small dove inside a circle. The symbol seemed almost too delicate for the heavy cup, pressed into the clay by a hand that had wanted it remembered. Before Caleb could look longer, his phone buzzed in the cup holder. Unknown number. He almost let it ring. Then some small instinct, the same one that had made him save the mug, told him to answer. "Mr. Mercer?" a woman's voice asked, formal but gentle. "This is Lydia Grant from Grant & Bell Legal Services in Willow Creek. I am calling regarding the estate of Eleanor Whitcomb." Caleb frowned. The name came back slowly. An elderly woman, a stalled car on a snowy road, a scarf the color of cranberry wool, hands wrapped around a paper cup of gas station coffee while he repaired her engine without charging her a cent. That had been years ago. "I remember her," he said. The woman on the phone grew softer. "Mrs. Whitcomb passed away last week. In her will, she left you Whitcomb Pottery, including the building, contents, and attached workshop." Caleb looked through the rain-streaked windshield, and for a moment the whole city seemed to fall silent around him. "There must be a mistake. She was very clear," Lydia said. "She wrote that you once fixed what everyone else ignored." Caleb turned slowly toward Atlas. The German shepherd was staring at the cracked mug, amber eyes bright, ears lifted as if hearing a kiln fire in a town neither of them had reached yet. Caleb picked up the mug and rubbed his thumb over the dove inside the circle. In the wet gray light, the mark looked less like decoration and more like a beginning. The call ended, but Caleb kept the phone pressed to his ear for several seconds after Lydia Grant's voice was gone, as if silence might add one more sentence that would make the impossible feel ordinary. Rain moved down the windshield in thin, trembling lines. The traffic light ahead turned green, then yellow, then red again, while the pickup sat unmoving at the curb. Atlas did not shift. The German shepherd remained focused on the cracked mug in Caleb's hand, black and tan coat brushed with subtle gray along the chest and muzzle, bright amber eyes steady beneath alert ears. Caleb turned the mug slowly, feeling the raised dove mark under his thumb. Eleanor Whitcomb. He remembered her now with a clarity that surprised him. A snowy evening on Route 7, a white sedan with its hood up, an elderly woman standing beside it in a cranberry scarf, trying to smile while her hands trembled from the cold. He had been coming home from a temporary repair job, exhausted and hungry, with Atlas asleep in the passenger seat. Other cars had passed. Caleb had stopped. It had taken him 30 minutes to get her engine running, and when she tried to pay him, he had refused. She had looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Young man, the world keeps receipts in ways we do not understand." He had laughed softly then, thinking it was just something kind older people said when they wanted to bless a stranger. Now, years later, sitting jobless in the rain with her pottery mark in his hand, he was not so sure. Lydia had told him Willow Creek was 90 miles southeast, a small arts town tucked between rolling hills and old mill roads. The legal office would be closed by the time he arrived, but Eleanor had left instructions for the key to be held by the caretaker of the building next door, a retired teacher named Mrs. Alice Harper. Caleb had almost said he could not come today. Then he looked at the fuel gauge, the box of belongings behind him, the $72 in his wallet, and the dog who had somehow known the broken mug mattered. There was nowhere else to go that made more sense. He drove out of Burlington as the afternoon darkened, leaving behind repair shops, apartment blocks, and wet traffic lights that smeared red and gold across the road. The highway unrolled through miles of autumn countryside, past dairy farms with white fences, covered bridges, maple stands losing their last bright leaves, and roadside barns painted with fading advertisements for apples, antiques, and maple syrup. The rain softened to mist, then returned in quiet waves, tapping the truck roof like someone thinking. Caleb kept one hand on the wheel and one near the mug in the cup holder. Atlas rode upright beside him, calm and watchful, ears lifting each time the road curved toward the south. "You know something I do not," Caleb said. Atlas blinked once, as if that had always been obvious. By the time Willow Creek appeared, evening had settled low over the hills. The town was smaller than Caleb expected, but not dead. It carried the tired beauty of places that had been loved hard and then slowly overlooked. Main Street ran along a narrow creek, its water dark and quick beneath old stone bridges. Brick storefronts lined the road, their upper windows glowing with weak apartment lights. A closed print shop had hand-painted letters peeling from the glass. A quilt store displayed faded fabric in careful squares. An old bakery still had a striped awning, though the windows were dark. At the far end of the street, beneath a crooked sign and a row of rain-blackened sycamores, stood Whitcomb Pottery. Caleb eased the pickup to the curb and let the engine idle. The building looked as if it had been holding its breath for 15 years. Its front window was filmed with dust, one corner veined by a crack that caught the street lamp. The sign above the door hung slightly crooked, the painted letters worn but readable. Whitcomb Pottery. Beneath them, in smaller script, handmade vessels, tiles, and repairs. The brick facade had dark stains from old weather. A shallow set of steps led to a green door with brass hardware dulled by time. In the rear window, visible through the narrow alley, a small yellow lamp hung unlit but still in place, like a promise no one had taken down. Caleb looked at the cracked mug, then at the sign. The same dove in a circle had been carved above the doorway, nearly hidden under grime. Atlas gave one low breath. Caleb opened the truck door. The air smelled of wet leaves, creek water, cold brick, and something faintly mineral, like clay after rain. His boots sounded heavy on the sidewalk. Before he reached the steps, the door of the neighboring building opened, and a woman in her 70s stepped out under a plaid umbrella. She was small but upright, with silver hair tucked beneath a knit hat and sharp eyes softened by age. "You must be Caleb Mercer," she said. "I am Alice Harper. Eleanor told me you would come with a dog." Caleb glanced at Atlas, who stood beside him in quiet attention. "She knew that?" Alice smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Eleanor knew more than she cared to explain." She handed him an envelope containing a key, a folded note, and a small card with the same dove mark stamped in blue ink. "She said you fixed what others passed by." Caleb looked down at the key. "I only fixed her car. Maybe that was enough." Alice turned toward the pottery shop, and her expression changed. "People around here say there is nothing left in that place but cracked shelves and bad memories. Do not believe people too quickly. Eleanor rarely wasted her silence." Caleb climbed the steps. Atlas moved ahead of him, then stopped abruptly at the threshold. His ears rose. His nose lowered toward a thin crack under the door, then shifted to the left side of the top step. There, half buried under mud and fallen leaves, one square tile was set into the stone. Caleb crouched and brushed it clean. A dove inside a circle emerged from beneath the dirt, the same mark as the mug, the same mark above the door. Atlas placed one paw gently on the tile. From somewhere inside the dark shop came a sound so faint Caleb almost missed it, a soft clink, like two pieces of pottery touching in an empty room. Alice heard it too. Her umbrella trembled slightly. "That shop has been locked since Eleanor died," she whispered. Caleb slid the key into the door. The lock turned with a reluctant click. When the door opened, a breath of old clay, dust, dry wood, and forgotten rain moved out to meet them. Atlas did not wait. He stepped inside first, amber eyes bright in the dimness, and Caleb followed him into the place Eleanor Whitcomb had left behind. The inside of Whitcomb Pottery felt less like an abandoned shop than a room holding its breath until the right person crossed the threshold. Caleb stood just inside the doorway with the old key still in his hand, rainwater dripping from the hem of his faded olive field jacket onto the dusty floorboards. The street lamp outside pressed a weak amber glow through the front window, revealing shelves that leaned slightly under the weight of bowls, pitchers, tiles, and broken pieces wrapped in yellowed paper. Clay dust lay over everything like pale ash. A pottery wheel sat near the center of the room, covered by a canvas cloth stiff with age. Along the far wall, a brick kiln rose broad and dark, its iron door closed, its surface marked by years of heat, patience, and hands that knew how to turn earth into something useful. Atlas moved ahead slowly, black and tan coat brushed with subtle gray along his chest and muzzle, bright amber eyes alert, ears high beneath the dim rafters. He sniffed the floor, the baseboards, the legs of the old worktables, then paused beside a row of crates filled with cracked cups and unfinished tiles. Caleb turned on the light switch, but only 2 bulbs flickered to life, both weak and golden, leaving the corners deep with shadow. Alice Harper waited near the doorway, her plaid umbrella folded at her side, her face thoughtful as she watched him take in the room. "Eleanor kept it exactly this way," she said softly. "People offered to clear it out. She said broken things were not trash just because they could not explain themselves." Caleb looked down at the mug he had carried from the truck. The dove inside the circle seemed warmer under the shop lights, as if the mark belonged here and had only been waiting to return. He placed the mug on the nearest worktable. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Atlas turned sharply toward the far wall. His ears lifted higher, and his body went still. Caleb followed the dog's stare to a narrow shelf beneath a dusty mirror. On the shelf were dozens of pottery fragments arranged by color: blue, cream, green, brown, gray. Not dumped, not forgotten, but sorted with care, each shard laid as if it still had a place in a larger design. The sight unsettled him more than disorder would have. This was not neglect. This was intention. Caleb stepped deeper into the room. The floorboards creaked but held. On one table, old brushes rested in a ceramic jar. On another, paper patterns were pinned beneath a smooth stone. Near the back, beside the kiln, a chalkboard hung on the wall with a line written in careful cursive: "Broken things remember the hands that made them." Caleb read it twice. The sentence entered him quietly, finding places in him he usually kept closed. Atlas gave a low breath and walked to the kiln. He did not bark. He simply stood before it with his nose near the lower bricks, then placed one paw on a cracked tile set into the floor. Caleb crouched beside him and brushed dust from the tile. Another dove mark appeared, smaller than the one at the door, pressed into the corner of the clay. "You saw this before I did," Caleb murmured. Atlas looked at him, then back at the kiln. Alice took one step forward, but no farther. "Eleanor used to say that kiln had a memory," she said. "I thought she meant all the years of firing clay." Caleb touched the floor near the dog's paw. The tile felt colder than the surrounding boards. He tapped it once with his knuckle. The sound was dull. He tapped the tile beside it. That one rang slightly hollow. His training had taught him to listen to materials, to engines, to walls, to the tiny difference between solid and false. The shop was speaking in small sounds. Before he could examine it further, headlights swept across the front window. Alice stiffened. A dark sedan rolled to the curb outside, its tires whispering over wet pavement. A man stepped out under a black umbrella, tall and polished in a navy overcoat, his shoes too clean for the weather, his smile visible even before he reached the glass. Alice's mouth tightened. "Martin Hale," she whispered. "He has wanted this block for years." Caleb rose slowly. Atlas moved between him and the kiln, not afraid, not aggressive, only certain. The front door opened without anyone inviting the man in. "Mrs. Harper," Martin said with practiced warmth. "And you must be Mr. Mercer. I heard you had arrived." His voice was smooth, pleasant, the kind used by men who never raised it because they had learned paperwork could do the pushing for them. Caleb said nothing at first. He watched Martin's eyes move across the room, not with sadness for Eleanor, not with respect for the old shop, but with quick calculation. The shelves, the kiln, the worktables, the rear hallway. When Martin noticed the cracked mug on the table, his smile faltered almost too briefly to catch. Atlas caught it. The dog's amber eyes fixed on the leather portfolio under Martin's arm. "I apologize for the late visit," Martin continued, stepping carefully around a crate of pottery shards. "Willow Creek is a small town. News moves quickly. Eleanor left you quite a burden." Caleb looked at the rows of broken pieces, the chalkboard sentence, the kiln Atlas guarded. "That is one word for it." Martin chuckled softly. A sentimental one might call it a legacy. A practical man would call it a liability. Old wiring, cracked foundation, unpaid maintenance, possible structural concerns. "You are recently arrived," and I imagine you have no interest in being trapped by someone else's memories." The words were polite, but they landed like cold fingers. Alice looked away. Caleb understood then that Martin knew more about him than a stranger should know. Recently arrived. No interest. Trapped. He had come not to welcome him, but to measure how little Caleb had left. Martin opened the portfolio and removed a prepared offer. "My company can take the building as is. Tonight, if necessary. You could leave Willow Creek with a clean check and no complications." Atlas gave one quiet sound from deep in his chest. Caleb did not look away from Martin. "You made an offer before I have even seen what is here." "Because I know what is here," Martin said. Then he corrected himself with a smile. "I know the property, I mean." Caleb looked past him to the kiln, to the dove mark beneath Atlas's paw, to the old mug on the table that had somehow followed him from a trash bin to this locked room. "I am not signing anything tonight." Martin's smile remained, but warmth left it. "Sleep on it then. Broken places have a way of looking romantic in the first hour." He set a business card on the table beside the mug. "By morning, they usually look expensive." When he left, the bell above the door gave a tired little ring, and the shop fell quiet again. Alice exhaled as if she had been holding her breath. Caleb picked up Martin's card, then placed it face down without reading it. Atlas turned back to the kiln and pawed once at the hollow tile. From somewhere beneath the floor came the faintest answering clink, delicate and clear, like a cup remembering the hand that shaped it. After Martin Hale left, the shop did not feel empty. It felt awake. Caleb stood beside the worktable with the business card turned face down near the cracked mug, listening to rain whisper against the front glass and the creek moving somewhere behind the row of old brick buildings. Alice Harper remained near the doorway, her folded umbrella tucked under one arm, eyes on the kiln where Atlas stood with one paw near the hollow tile. The German shepherd's black and tan coat caught the weak shop light, subtle gray along his chest and muzzle giving him the look of an old soul in a strong body. His bright amber eyes did not leave the floor. "He has done that before?" Alice asked softly. Caleb shook his head. "Only when something matters." The words sounded simple, but they settled into the room like a match struck in darkness. Alice looked toward the street, where Martin's sedan had vanished into the wet evening. Eleanor never trusted him. She said he listened to buildings the way some men listen to bank vaults. Caleb almost smiled at that, but the smile did not reach him. He crouched beside Atlas and tapped the tile again, then the board beside it, then the brick base of the kiln. There it was, a slight difference, a hidden space answering from below. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just the small hollow truth of a place that had been covered carefully. "Did Eleanor ever mention a basement?" he asked. "No," Alice said. "The building has a crawl space in the county records, but nothing more." Caleb glanced at the chalkboard line above the workbench. Broken things remember the hands that made them. Then he looked at the mug. Its hairline crack seemed to follow a path through the glaze, ending near the dove mark on the bottom. He picked it up and turned it under the light. The mark was not only a stamp. Around the dove were tiny impressions, almost invisible under dirt, like dots pressed by the tip of a tool. Atlas lifted his head the moment Caleb touched them. Caleb carried the mug to the shelf of sorted fragments. The fragments were arranged by color, but now he saw they had also been placed by shape. Crescent, curve, line, wing. He selected a green shard with a matching edge and held it beside the mug. It fit against the broken rim like a memory returning to its sentence. Alice covered her mouth. She kept every piece. Caleb found another shard, this one cream with a thin blue line, then a third with two tiny dots along the glaze. He placed them on the table around the mug. Together, the marks formed part of a simple map, a circle for the kiln, a line toward the rear wall, 3 dots under the floor. Not decoration. Directions. Caleb felt the hair on the back of his neck rise, not from fear, but from wonder sharpened by caution. Eleanor Whitcomb had not left him a ruin. She had left him a puzzle made of the very things other people had dismissed as broken. Alice leaned closer. The rear wall backs up to the old clay room. She locked it after her husband died. No one went in after that. Caleb looked toward the narrow hallway beyond the kiln. Dust lay undisturbed across the threshold. Atlas moved before he did, padding down the hallway with careful steps, ears alert, nose low. Caleb followed with the flashlight from his truck. Alice remained in the main room, not out of fear, but as if she understood that some doors should be opened first by the person they were meant for. The clay room was small and cold. Stacks of dry clay blocks sat on wooden pallets, wrapped in brittle paper. Hooks on the wall held aprons stiff with old dust. A rolling table stood under a narrow window filmed white by years of weather. On the far wall was a cabinet with small drawers labeled cobalt, ash, iron, river blue, bone white. Atlas went straight to the drawer marked river blue and sat down. Caleb pulled it open. Instead of glazed powder, it held a folded note sealed in wax with the dove mark. His name was written on the front. Caleb opened it with both hands. "Mr. Mercer," the note began, "if Atlas has brought you here, then the good Lord gave that dog a better nose for truth than most people have for kindness. Do not sell the shop until you understand why the broken pieces were saved. The kiln is not the secret. It is the lock." Caleb read the last line twice. "The kiln is not the secret. It is the lock." Behind him, Atlas gave a low, steady breath. Caleb returned to the main room and showed Alice the note. She read it in silence, and when she handed it back, her eyes shone. "That sounds like Eleanor." Caleb studied the kiln again. Its iron door was closed, its bricks darkened by decades of firing. Near the bottom edge, half hidden by dust, were 3 small round holes set into the brickwork. Caleb brought the mug and the 3 shards close. The dots on the pieces matched the holes. Not perfectly at first, but when he arranged them in order, dove, line, wing, river, the pattern became clear. He pressed the cracked mug gently against the center mark above the kiln's lower bricks. Nothing happened. Then Atlas nudged one of the shards with his nose, sliding it slightly to the left on the table. Caleb adjusted the order and tried again. This time, a soft click sounded from inside the kiln, followed by the faint grinding of old metal settling after years of sleep. Alice stepped back. Caleb placed both hands on the kiln door and pulled. It opened slowly, not into the firing chamber he expected, but into a narrow space behind it where a second iron panel had been built into the wall. On that panel was a handle shaped like the dove inside the circle. The air that drifted out smelled of dry clay, cool stone, and paper sealed away from time. Atlas sat beside Caleb, calm and certain, as though this was the answer he had been waiting for since the mug first appeared in the trash. Caleb looked at Alice. "Eleanor built a door inside the kiln," Alice whispered. "No wonder she said fire remembers." Caleb wrapped his hand around the dove-shaped handle and pulled. The panel opened inward to reveal a short set of steps descending below the shop, lit only by the thin beam of his flashlight. The silence beneath was deep, but not empty. It felt arranged. Protected. Waiting. Caleb thought of Martin Hale arriving too quickly, of the offer ready before the dust had even settled on his first footsteps, of Eleanor's sentence written across the chalkboard like a prayer for damaged things. He lifted the flashlight, and Atlas stepped down first, one paw at a time, leading the way into the hidden room beneath Whitcomb Pottery. Atlas descended first, his paws quiet on the narrow steps behind the kiln, and Caleb followed with one hand on the wall and the flashlight held low so the beam would not blind the dog. The air beneath Whitcomb Pottery was cooler than the shop above, dry and still, carrying the mineral smell of clay, old wood, sealed paper, and time folded carefully away. Each step creaked, but none gave way. Eleanor had not built a hiding place in panic. She had built it like a second studio, patient and deliberate, a room below the broken world where the truth could keep its shape. At the bottom, Caleb lifted the flashlight and stopped breathing for a moment. The hidden room stretched beneath the back half of the shop, longer than he expected, its stone walls lined with wooden shelves and its ceiling braced by heavy beams darkened with age. White cloth covered rows of tall pottery forms. Work tables stood in the center, arranged with brushes, glazed jars, notebooks, and clay tools as if Eleanor might return at sunrise to finish what she had started. Along the far wall, a narrow ventilation shaft carried in a whisper of rain and creek air from somewhere behind the building. Alice Harper stood on the steps above, one hand against the rail, her face pale in the flashlight glow. "I lived next door for 20 years," she whispered. "I never knew this was here." Caleb moved slowly to the nearest shelf. Atlas stayed at his side, black and tan coat brushed with subtle gray along his chest and muzzle, bright amber eyes alert, ears raised towards sounds too small for human hearing. Caleb lifted the corner of a white cloth. Beneath it stood a vase nearly 2 feet tall, glazed in a deep blue-green that seemed to hold both river water and storm clouds inside it. Fine lines of silver ran through the surface like light caught in cracked ice. It was not shiny in the ordinary way. It glowed softly, as if the clay remembered fire but had chosen calm. Around its base was the dove inside the circle. Caleb uncovered another piece, then another. Bowls, vessels, tiles, narrow jars with sealed lids, all bearing the same mark, all finished with that strange river blue glaze. Even without knowing pottery, he understood they were rare. Not because they looked expensive, though they did, but because every piece carried the silence of hands that had made something honest and then hidden it from people who would have measured it only in dollars. On the center table lay a ledger open to the first page. Caleb read the words written at the top in Eleanor's careful hand: "The River Blue Collection, final firing, not for sale until Willow Creek remembers who it belongs to." Beneath the line were dates, kiln temperatures, clay sources, buyer names, appraisals, and notes about families along Main Street who had once worked in the old artisan block. Alice came down the last steps and touched the edge of the table as if she needed proof the room was real. "River blue," she said softly. "People used to ask about that glaze. Eleanor always said she lost the formula." Caleb looked at the rows of covered shelves. "She did not lose it." Atlas gave a small, focused breath and walked toward the far corner, where several ceramic tubes stood upright in a wooden crate. Each tube had been sealed at both ends with wax marked by the dove. Caleb knelt beside them. The dog pressed his nose to one tube, then looked back at Caleb. "Another message?" Caleb murmured. He lifted the tube carefully. It was heavier than it looked. On its side, written in blue glaze, were the words, "Main Street, Hale Filings." Alice drew in a sharp breath. Caleb broke the wax seal with a small clay knife from the table and slid out a roll of paper wrapped in oilskin. Inside were copies of letters, property maps, and agreements marked with dates from 15 years earlier. He recognized Martin Hale's name immediately, along with the names of several shop owners whose storefronts he had passed on the way in: the print shop, the quilt store, the bakery, 2 studios now dark. The papers told a quiet, ugly story without ever raising their voice. Low offers made to aging owners. Repair notices filed within days of refusals. Tax assessments questioned. Buildings described as unsafe before anyone had inspected them. It was not the kind of wrongdoing that broke windows. It was the kind that dimmed lights, one storefront at a time, until a street forgot it had once been alive. Caleb set the papers down with care. Alice's eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. "Eleanor said Martin was not buying buildings. He was buying surrender." The words hung in the underground room, soft but exact. Caleb opened another ceramic tube. This one contained photographs of Main Street years ago, open doors, flower boxes, children painting tiles at a sidewalk fair, Eleanor standing beside a younger Alice, holding a blue-green bowl up to the sun. Behind them, Martin Hale's father stood near a construction sign, smiling for a newspaper camera. A third tube held appraisal letters for the river blue pieces. Caleb did not understand every number, but he understood enough. The collection was worth far more than the shop above, far more than any quick check Martin could have offered. But Eleanor had hidden more than value. She had hidden proof that the old artisan block had been pressured, cornered, and quietly scattered. Atlas moved again, this time to a covered object at the very back of the room. It was smaller than the vases, resting on its own pedestal beneath a cloth tied with blue ribbon. Caleb untied it. Underneath was a simple cracked mug, almost identical to the one he had saved from the trash, except this one had been repaired with thin lines of pale gold filling the crack. Inside the mug was a folded note. Caleb opened it. "Mr. Mercer," it read, "if you are standing here, then you know why I chose you. Not because you are rich, powerful, or loud. Because when something was stranded on a cold road, you stopped. Because when something was broken, you did not ask whether it was worth enough to fix. The shop needs that kind of hands now." Caleb sat down slowly on the edge of the workbench. Above them, rain continued to move over Willow Creek. In the hidden studio, surrounded by vessels that had survived darkness without losing their color, he felt the strange ache of being seen by someone who had met him only once, and still trusted the best part of him. Atlas came close and rested his head against Caleb's knee. The dog had followed a mug, a mark, a hollow tile, and a kiln door into a room where broken things had guarded the truth better than people had. Caleb looked at the repaired mug with its gold-filled crack. For the first time all day, he did not feel discarded. He felt chosen. The hidden studio held Caleb in a silence so complete that even the rain above seemed far away. He sat on the edge of Eleanor's workbench with Atlas pressed against his knee, the repaired mug in his hands and the note resting open beneath the flashlight. Chosen. The word did not feel comfortable at first. Caleb had spent too many years being useful only until someone found a cheaper tool, too many months taking whatever repair work came his way, too many mornings waking with the feeling that life had placed him on a shelf for cracked things. Yet Eleanor Whitcomb, an old potter he had helped once on a snowy roadside, had looked at him and seen something he had almost stopped seeing in himself. Alice Harper stood beside the table, her fingers resting lightly on the ledger marked the River Blue Collection. Her eyes moved over the shelves, the covered vessels, the ceramic tubes, the maps, the names of Main Street families written in Eleanor's steady hand. "She carried all of this alone," Alice said. Caleb looked at the papers spread before them, the repair notices, property offers, appraisals, old photographs, and letters that tied Martin Hale's name to years of quiet pressure. "Not alone," he said softly. "She left it where someone could find it." Atlas lifted his head as if he approved of the distinction. They worked carefully through the night, not rushing, not celebrating, just documenting what the room had kept safe. Alice wrote down the order of each ceramic tube. Caleb photographed the labels with his phone and placed every paper back in its oilskin wrap. They uncovered only 6 pieces of the River Blue collection at first, enough to understand the collection's importance without exposing everything at once. The glaze changed under every angle of light, blue near the rim, green near the base, silver lines crossing the surface like creek water under moonlight. Some vessels were tall and narrow. Others were simple bowls with rims so thin they seemed almost impossible. None felt made for display alone. They felt like containers for memory. Near dawn, Alice climbed back upstairs to call Lydia Grant from the legal office. Caleb stayed below with Atlas, sorting the documents into 3 groups on the table: art records, property records, and Eleanor's personal messages. That was when he found the cassette recorder. It sat inside a wooden drawer beneath the ledger, wrapped in a piece of soft blue cloth. A label on the front read, "For Caleb, when the room is open." His breath slowed. Atlas, who had been lying beside the workbench, sat up at once. Caleb pressed play. At first, there was only a soft hiss, then the faint scrape of a chair, and finally Eleanor's voice, thin with age but warm enough to fill the stone room. "Mr. Mercer," she began, "I hope you will forgive an old woman for placing a burden inside a gift. I did not know how else to protect what Willow Creek forgot it loved." Caleb closed his eyes. The voice continued, telling the story of Whitcomb Pottery, how she and her husband had opened the shop when Main Street still smelled of bread, sawdust, wet clay, and coffee every morning. Artists had shared tools. Children had painted tiles for the creek bridge. On summer nights, the shop doors stayed open late, and neighbors brought chairs to the sidewalk. Then came the offers. Quiet at first. Friendly. Reasonable. Martin Hale's father wanted one building, then 3, then the whole block. When people refused, fees appeared, inspections became complicated, and rumors made owners tired. I watched good people sell because they were worn down, not because they stopped loving what they had built, Eleanor said. That is a slow kind of loss, Caleb. It does not make noise. It simply teaches a town to lower its lights. Caleb opened his eyes and looked toward the ceiling, imagining the dark storefronts he had passed on the way in. The print shop. The quilt store. The bakery. Lights lowered one by one. Eleanor explained that the river blue glaze had become valuable after a collector from Boston identified one of her pieces at an estate sale. Martin learned of it before the town did. He tried to buy the shop, then the formula, then the land. Eleanor refused, but she knew value alone would not save the block. So she hid the collection beneath the kiln and sealed the evidence of the property pressure inside ceramic tubes, trusting clay more than filing cabinets. Clay remembers fire, she said. Paper remembers signatures. A dog remembers what a hurried man overlooks. And kindness, if we let it, remembers the road back. The recorder clicked softly, but her message was not finished. I chose you because you did not ask what my car was worth before you fixed it. You did not ask what I could give you. You stopped because someone was stranded. The shop needs a person like that. Willow Creek needs a person like that. Perhaps you do too. Caleb lowered his head, the repaired mug resting between his hands. Atlas leaned against his leg. The underground room did not feel like a burden anymore. It felt like a threshold. When Alice returned with Lydia Grant on speakerphone, the legal steps began to form around the miracle. Lydia's voice was alert, professional, and quietly stunned as Caleb described the hidden studio, the documents, and the collection. She told them to secure the room, touch as little as possible, and bring the property records to her office after sunrise. She also said something that made Alice put a hand over her heart. Eleanor had filed a preservation intent notice years earlier, incomplete but valid enough to reopen review if supporting evidence appeared. Supporting evidence had appeared under the kiln in blue glazed tubes. By 7 in the morning, the rain had stopped. Caleb climbed the steps behind Atlas and emerged into the pottery shop changed by daylight. Dust floated in pale beams. The cracked shelves still leaned. The floor still needed repair. The front window was still veined with a long crack. But the room no longer looked dead to him. It looked unfinished. On the worktable, the broken mug from the trash sat beside Eleanor's repaired one, the 2 cups facing each other like before and after. Caleb placed Martin Hale's business card between them, then turned it over and wrote one sentence on the back, "Not for sale." Atlas sat by the kiln, bright amber eyes calm, ears relaxed for the first time since they had entered Willow Creek. Alice stood near the door, watching morning light touch the dove mark above the entrance. "What will you do now?" she asked. Caleb looked around at the old wheel, the chalkboard sentence, the shelves of broken pieces saved with such tenderness. He thought of the shop manager in Burlington, the cardboard box, the rain, the moment he had believed his life had been reduced to whatever fit behind a pickup seat. Then he looked at Atlas, who had followed a broken mug into a hidden truth. "First," Caleb said, "we make sure Martin Hale cannot bury this again." Outside, the creek moved behind Main Street, bright after the storm. For the first time since losing his job, Caleb did not wonder where he would sleep. The shop had floors to mend, records to protect, and a kiln that had become a doorway. It was not much of a home yet. But sometimes home begins as a place that trusts your hands before you do. By mid-morning, Willow Creek had begun to stir around Whitcomb Pottery, not loudly, but with the cautious curiosity of a town hearing an old song through a wall. Caleb stood behind the counter with Eleanor's property records sealed in a weatherproof folder, the blue-glazed ceramic tubes wrapped in towels inside a wooden crate, and Atlas beside him, calm and steady, black and tan coat brushed with subtle gray along his chest and muzzle, bright amber eyes watching the front door as if it were a question waiting to be answered. Alice Harper had gone next door to make coffee and call 2 former shop owners whose names appeared in Eleanor's ledger. Lydia Grant was on her way from her office with instructions to bring everything to the county clerk before noon. The rain had left the sidewalks shining. Across Main Street, the dark windows of the print shop reflected the pale sky, and the creek behind the buildings ran clear over stones, carrying yellow leaves beneath the footbridge where children had once painted tiles. Caleb looked at the chalkboard sentence again. Broken things remember the hands that made them. The words no longer felt like comfort alone. They felt like work. A bell above the door gave a dry little ring, and a woman in a bakery apron stepped inside. She was in her 60s, with flour on one sleeve and a guarded expression that softened the moment she saw the pottery shelves. Alice said Eleanor kept photographs. She said, "My parents owned the bakery before Hale bought the back half of the block." Caleb nodded and opened the ledger to the page marked Whitman Bakery. The woman came closer, one hand pressed to her mouth as she saw the old sidewalk fair photo, her younger self standing beside Eleanor, holding a tray of cookies shaped like little blue bowls. She did not cry loudly. She only touched the edge of the photograph and whispered, "I thought all of this was gone." More people arrived after that, one by one, as if they had been waiting for permission to remember. A retired printer with ink still stained in the lines of his fingers. A quilt maker who had moved her shop into her garage after losing the lease. A music teacher whose father had carved display shelves for Eleanor in exchange for pottery lessons. Each person recognized something in the photographs, a face, a sign, a tile, a doorway that had once been theirs. Atlas moved among them with quiet dignity, accepting a gentle hand now and then, but always returning to Caleb's side. The shop, which had felt like a sealed room the night before, began to breathe with voices. Not loud voices. Careful ones. People spoke the way they do near old family albums, afraid that too much sound might disturb the past. Lydia Grant arrived just before 11, carrying a leather case and wearing rain boots under her suit pants. She was practical, sharp-eyed, and moved with the focus of someone who had spent years reading what people tried to hide between lines. Caleb laid the documents before her on Eleanor's work table. Lydia examined the preservation notice, the property maps, the repair filings, the offers, and the appraisal letters for the River Blue collection. Her expression did not change quickly, but her pen began moving faster. "This is enough to request an immediate hold on any pending redevelopment filings tied to the artisan block," she said. "It may also reopen the history of several transfers if the owners are willing to give statements." The retired printer straightened. "I will give one." The bakery woman nodded. "So will I." Others followed, quietly but firmly. Caleb looked around the shop at people who had been scattered, discouraged, and dimmed, now standing beneath Eleanor's dusty rafters as if the old building had gathered them back into shape. That was when Atlas turned toward the front window. His ears lifted. His body became still. Outside, Martin Hale crossed the street in a camel-colored coat, moving quickly now, without the easy pace he had used the night before. He entered without knocking, took in the crowd, the documents, Lydia's leather case, the crate of ceramic tubes, and for the first time his polished smile did not arrive in time. "This is private property," Caleb said before Martin spoke. Martin looked at him, then at Lydia. "Mr. Mercer, I came to prevent a misunderstanding." Lydia closed the folder in front of her. "Then you are late. The misunderstanding has been documented." A murmur passed through the room, soft as wind through paper. Martin recovered enough to smooth his coat. "Eleanor was an emotional woman. She kept things because she could not let go. I would be careful building accusations from grief and pottery shards." Caleb felt the old familiar pressure in those words, the attempt to make truth sound foolish because it had been preserved by gentle hands. Before he could answer, the bakery woman stepped forward and placed her photograph on the table. "That is my mother's storefront in the background," she said. "And that is the first notice your company sent us, 3 days after we refused your offer." The retired printer added his page. The quilt maker added hers. One by one, the people of Willow Creek placed their pieces beside Eleanor's records. The table became a map of quiet harm and quieter courage. Martin's face paled just enough for Caleb to see. Atlas stood between the man and the kiln, not making a sound. Lydia gathered the papers into order. Mr. Hale, any further communication should come through my office. The county will receive these records today. Martin looked toward the kiln, and his eyes lingered there half a second too long. Caleb noticed. Atlas noticed first. The dog gave one low breath and stepped closer to the brick base. Martin saw the movement and forced a small laugh. All this for a broken shop. Caleb picked up the repaired mug from the work table, the one Eleanor had lined with pale gold where the crack had been. He held it carefully, not as a weapon, not as proof, but as a lesson. Broken does not mean empty, he said. The room went still. Martin had no answer that would not reveal more than he wanted to show. He left with the bell giving the same dry ring above him, but the sound felt different now. Not tired. Released. After he was gone, Lydia locked the most important documents in her case, and Alice returned with coffee, paper cups, and a look on her face Caleb could only describe as hope trying not to seem too eager. By noon, the first statements had been signed. By 1, Lydia was driving the records to the county office. By 2, Caleb stood alone again in Whitcomb Pottery with Atlas and the dust, though the room no longer felt abandoned. Sunlight broke through the front window for the first time that day, catching the river blue glaze on one uncovered bowl until the color spread across the table like water under the sky. Caleb touched the cracked mug he had saved from the trash, then the repaired one Eleanor had left for him. 2 broken things, one unfinished and one made beautiful by care. Atlas rested his head against Caleb's leg, amber eyes gentle now. Outside, Willow Creek moved on in its ordinary way, but something beneath it had shifted. A town that had been taught to lower its lights had remembered where the switches were. By late afternoon, the county office had received more truth than its old filing cabinets had seen in years. Lydia Grant called from the courthouse steps while Caleb stood behind the counter of Whitcomb Pottery with Atlas beside him, and the repaired mug resting near the cash register. Her voice sounded tired, but there was a quiet brightness underneath it. The preservation intent notice had been accepted for emergency review. The redevelopment filings tied to the artisan block were being paused until the records could be examined. The clerk had recognized 2 of the names from Eleanor's documents, and had gone silent for a long moment before saying, "I remember my mother buying bowls from that shop." Caleb listened with one hand on the phone and one hand resting on Atlas's head. The German shepherd stood calm and loyal, black and tan coat brushed with subtle gray along his chest and muzzle, bright amber eyes turned toward the front windows where Main Street glowed after rain. "So what happens now?" Caleb asked. "No," Lydia said. "We protect the documents, verify the transfers, and keep Mr. Hale from moving anything quietly. And Caleb, do not underestimate what Eleanor did. This is not just about one shop." He looked across the room at the shelves of broken pottery pieces, the covered wheel, the kiln that had become a doorway, and the chalkboard sentence that seemed to grow truer every time he read it. "Broken things remember the hands that made them." "I am starting to understand that," he said. After the call, Alice Harper returned with a box of old towels, a broom, and sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. She did not ask permission before beginning to sweep the front room. That was how the evening became something Caleb had not planned, not a reopening, not a meeting, not a celebration, but a gathering of useful hands. The retired printer came back with a roll of brown paper to cover the work tables. The bakery woman brought coffee in a thermos and a bag of day-old rolls that tasted better than anything Caleb had eaten in weeks. The quilt maker brought soft cloth for wrapping the river blue pieces. A music teacher arrived carrying a small toolkit, saying Eleanor had once taught his daughter to shape a clay bird, and he had owed the shop a hinge repair for 20 years. Caleb almost told them they did not have to help. Then he stopped himself. Some gifts are diminished when a man refuses them out of pride. So he let the town work around him. Dust rose in pale clouds. Windows were wiped clean enough to admit the low amber light. Crates were labeled. Floorboards were checked. The front display table was cleared, and Caleb placed one river blue bowl at its center, not for sale, not yet, but as proof that something beautiful had survived below what everyone had called ruined. Atlas settled near the kiln, eyes half closed, but every so often his ears turned toward the hidden stair as if listening for Eleanor's old tools to shift in their sleep. Near sunset, Deputy Marlene Brooks arrived from the county sheriff's office, sent by Lydia to make a formal record of the hidden studio. She was a sturdy woman in her 50s with practical boots, rain beads on her jacket, and the calm expression of someone who preferred facts over drama. Caleb led her behind the kiln with Alice and 2 witnesses from town. The deputy descended slowly, shining her light over the shelves, ceramic tubes, maps, ledgers, and covered vessels. She did not speak for almost a full minute. When she finally did, her voice was soft. "Mrs. Whitcomb built herself a time capsule," Alice answered from the steps. "No. She built us a memory we could not sell. Deputy Brooks wrote that down." Caleb noticed. Back upstairs, she signed the inventory sheet, photographed the doorway, and told Caleb the room should remain locked until Lydia arranged proper cataloging. "You did right calling this in," she said. "A lot of people would have seen $signs first." Caleb glanced at the repaired mug with the gold-filled crack. "I almost did not know what I was seeing." Deputy Brooks looked at Atlas. "Looks like somebody did." Atlas lifted his head just enough to accept the compliment, then rested it again on his paws. By dusk, the helpers drifted away, promising to return in the morning. Alice was the last to leave. She stood at the door, looking at the cleaned window, the visible dove mark above the entrance, and the one river blue bowl glowing on the display table. "She would have liked seeing light in here again," she said. Caleb nodded. "I wish she could." Alice smiled sadly. "Maybe this is how she does." After she left, Caleb locked the door and stood alone with Atlas in the quiet shop. Outside, Willow Creek settled into evening, tires on damp pavement, the creek behind the buildings, a church bell somewhere beyond Main Street, the low hum of life continuing. Caleb spread his sleeping bag near the back wall, not because he had nowhere else to sleep now, though that was still partly true, but because he did not want the shop to spend its first night awake alone. He fed Atlas, poured water into a ceramic bowl he found under the counter, and turned off all but one lamp. In the warm half-light, the pottery shelves no longer looked like rows of damage. They looked like pieces waiting for patient hands. Caleb sat on the floor beside the kiln and picked up the cracked mug from the trash. Its broken line remained dark, unrepaired, honest. He set it beside Eleanor's gold-mended mug. The 2 cups seemed to speak across the floor, what is wounded, and what may still be restored. Atlas came and lay beside him, pressing his shoulder against Caleb's leg. The old loneliness did not vanish. Healing was not that simple. But it loosened. It gave him room to breathe. For the first time since Burlington, since the manager's careful words, since the rain in the parking lot, and the cardboard box by his boots, Caleb did not feel like a man waiting for the next door to close. He felt like a man sitting inside a place that had opened because he had once stopped for a stranger in the snow. Near midnight, just as Caleb began to drift toward sleep, Atlas lifted his head. Not sharply. Not with alarm. Slowly, as if hearing a familiar sound from far away. A soft clink came from the kiln. Then another. Caleb opened his eyes. The shop was still. The hidden door was closed. The river blue bowl on the display table caught the lamplight and sent a faint blue reflection across the ceiling. Atlas stood, walked to the kiln, and sat before it with calm certainty. Caleb followed, kneeling beside him. On the brick beside the dove handle, a tiny line of dust had fallen away, revealing words scratched into the clay so lightly they had been invisible before. "When the shop is safe, fire the last piece." Caleb touched the words with 2 fingers. Somewhere beneath the floor, the old studio seemed to wait again, not with urgency, but with faith. Eleanor had left one more task. And this time, Caleb did not feel afraid of being chosen. Morning came to Whitcomb Pottery with the soft patience of light returning to a room that had waited 15 years to be seen. Caleb woke on the sleeping bag near the back wall, one arm folded beneath his head, the smell of clay dust, old wood, and cooling rain wrapped around him like a strange kind of peace. Atlas lay beside the kiln, black and tan coat brushed with subtle gray along his chest and muzzle, bright amber eyes already open, alert ears turned toward the hidden door as if he had kept watch over Eleanor's last instruction all night. When the first sunlight touched the front window, it passed through the river blue bowl on the display table and scattered a pale blue glow across the ceiling. Caleb sat up slowly, reading again the words scratched into the brick beside the dove handle. When the shop is safe, fire the last piece. Safe did not mean finished. He understood that now. The county review would take time. Lydia Grant would spend weeks sorting filings, statements, appraisals, and preservation forms. Martin Hale would likely send lawyers, letters, and careful objections. The old block would not be healed by one hidden room or one good morning. But safety sometimes begins with enough truth standing in the open that a lie can no longer move quietly. By 8, Alice Harper arrived with coffee, a basket of muffins, and 3 volunteers who asked no grand questions and went straight to work. By 9, Lydia called to say the emergency hold had been approved pending full review, and the artisan block could not be transferred, demolished, or redeveloped while the documents were under investigation. Caleb stood behind the counter as she spoke, his hand resting on Eleanor's repaired mug, its gold-filled crack catching the light. "That gives us time," Lydia said. Caleb looked at Atlas, who sat beside the kiln like a guardian of patient fire. "Then we use it right," he answered. The last piece waited in the hidden studio beneath a blue cloth at the far end of the workbench, beside a sealed jar labeled Final Glaze. Caleb found it after Alice unlocked the kiln door with him and Deputy Brooks returned to witness the inventory. It was not large. Not a vase, not a bowl, not a showpiece meant to impress collectors. It was a simple clay tile, unfired, wrapped in linen, its surface carved with the dove inside the circle and the outline of Main Street as it had been years ago. Bakery, print shop, quilt store, pottery shop, creek bridge, and the little empty space where people used to gather during summer art nights. On the back, Eleanor had carved one sentence before the clay dried, "For the hands that come back." Caleb held the tile carefully, feeling the dryness of it, the fragility, the risk. Unfired clay could still become almost anything, but it could also break if handled carelessly. Alice stood beside him in silence, her eyes shining. "She meant for the town to finish it," she said. Caleb looked around at the hidden studio, the shelves of river blue vessels, the ceramic tubes that had protected the truth, the tools Eleanor had cleaned before leaving them for someone else. "Then the town should be here." That evening, as sunset warmed the wet brick of Main Street, the front door of Whitcomb Pottery opened not for customers but for witnesses. The bakery woman came with coffee. The retired printer brought a stack of blank cards for people to write names on. The quilt maker brought blue cloth to cover the display tables. The music teacher brought his daughter, now grown, who still remembered making a clay bird in Eleanor's shop when she was 7. Lydia stood near the counter with the legal documents secured in her case. Deputy Brooks stood by the door, not like a guard, but like someone honoring a promise to keep the peace. Caleb placed the unfired tile on the kiln shelf with hands steadier than he expected. Atlas sat at his side, bright amber eyes calm, ears relaxed, the same loyal posture that had carried Caleb from a rainy parking lot to this room of returned light. When Caleb closed the kiln, the sound was not heavy. It was gentle, like a book being shut at the end of a chapter. The firing took hours, and no one rushed it. People told stories while they waited. Alice spoke of Eleanor teaching children to center clay on the wheel. The printer remembered trading business cards for soup bowls. The bakery woman remembered Eleanor buying day-old bread every Friday and leaving exact change even when told not to. Caleb listened more than he spoke. He had been good at silence for years, but this silence was different. It did not isolate him. It made room. Near midnight, when the kiln finally cooled enough to open, the shop had grown quiet. Caleb turned the handle and eased the door wide. Warmth breathed into the room, carrying the scent of fired clay and something almost sweet, like rain leaving stone. The tile had changed from dull earth to deep river blue, its carved lines filled with silver glaze that caught the lamplight. Main Street shimmered across its surface, not as property, not as a development plan, but as memory made durable. The dove at the center glowed softly. No one clapped at first. It would have felt too loud. Alice simply reached for Caleb's hand and held it. Atlas stepped closer, sniffed the warm air, then sat down with a satisfied breath, as if his work had finally reached the place he knew it would. Over the following weeks, the review widened. More records surfaced. Former owners gave statements. The preservation notice became active. The River Blue collection was catalogued with help from a museum in Montpellier, and several pieces were valued high enough to fund repairs without selling the soul of the shop. Martin Hale's redevelopment plan stalled, then withdrew under the weight of documents he had counted on being lost. There was no dramatic downfall, no thunderous justice, only the steady turning of truth through proper hands. That was enough. By winter, the front window of Whitcomb Pottery had been repaired. The sign hung straight again. The old wheel had been cleaned and oiled. On Saturday mornings, children came to make uneven bowls while their parents drank coffee from the bakery next door. Caleb kept the cracked mug from the trash on the shelf behind the counter, unrepaired, beside Eleanor's gold-mended one. He liked them together, one showing where the break began, the other showing what care could make of it. Atlas slept near the kiln during classes, waking whenever small hands dropped clay or laughter rose too suddenly, then settling again when he saw everything was well. On the first snow of December, Caleb stepped outside before opening the shop. Main Street was quiet, roofs sugared white, creek dark under a lace of ice. He wore the same faded olive field jacket, plain work shirt, worn jeans, and rugged boots, but he no longer felt like a man carrying his life in a cardboard box. He turned the sign to open, filled Atlas's ceramic water bowl, and lit the lamp above the river blue tile mounted by the door. For the hands that come back. Caleb looked at the words, then at the dog who had found a secret inside a broken thing. He had not been searching for a miracle when he saved that cracked mug from the trash. He had only been unwilling to let one more useful thing be thrown away. But kindness has a way of remembering its route. Sometimes it travels through snow, through clay, through a dog's bright eyes, through the silence of an old shop, until it finds the person who needs to be reminded that broken does not mean finished. And in Willow Creek, under the warm light of a once-forgotten pottery shop, Caleb finally believed it.